The historic Texas State Cemetery, like the state its heroes and legends have sacrificed for, is a place that can't be easily described. Perhaps the best way to begin telling about it is by visiting with famous Texans who've known some of those buried there. Their stories are coming up next on Heroes and Legends of the Texas State Cemetery. The Texas State Cemetery was established in 1851 as a resting place for legendary Texas heroes, Civil War veterans, public officials, and others who have made significant contributions to the state. Every grave has a story, stories that are sometimes mixed with myth. And then again, this is Texas, where many of our heroes and legends are known beyond the boundaries of this state and may at times appear larger than life.
Do you recall a decisive moment when you decided, yes, I will be a candidate, I will run, I will seek office?
Oh, of course I do. But I ran for office, I think, really for the wrong reasons. You usually run, most people I know, because they have a passionate desire to be in public office. I ran because the guy that was in the office was so bad that I said to myself, good grief, we can do better than that.
Most Texans know that you're pretty comfortable saying exactly what's on your mind. Where does that come from?
My father was that way. He never hesitated to say exactly what he thought. My mother never hesitated at home. She was always a little more circumspect in public. But I think it came from being in an atmosphere where people express their opinions and were not afraid to do it. I think it's, too, because I grew up in the country. I was not a city girl. In the country, you're much more straightforward in your business. Your dealings are always direct and to the point. And that's probably had a lot to do with it, too.
Although Miriam, or Ma Ferguson, certainly broke ground being the first female governor in Texas, I wonder, at the time that you ran, were the rules different for men than they were for women as the candidates, or?
By and large, any woman who runs for office has to be better. She has to work harder. It's more difficult for a woman to be elected. Now, I must say that it is improving. Certainly it's different than it was when I ran for the first time. Now, Ma Ferguson, when Ma ran, it was because Pa had been impeached. Pa was her husband, and he was the governor, and he was convicted of selling pardons to prisoners in the penitentiary. So Ma then ran and was elected in his stead after he went to the pen himself. The great line from the time that Ma was governor the first time was that there was a driving issue in Texas, and it was whether or not kids were going to be punished if they spoke Spanish in the public school. And they asked Ma what she thought, and Ma said that if the English language was good enough for Jesus Christ, it was good enough for the school children of Texas. When I gave the Democratic Convention keynote address in 1988 in Atlanta, Georgia, I wanted to emphasize the fact that I was a female and how rare it was for females to have an opportunity to do what I was doing. Barbara Jordan had been the other female that had made the keynote speech at the Democratic Convention. And so I'd used this line for a long time, that is that Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did. She just did it backwards and in high heels. And it is so true that women can do everything men do. They just have a harder time of doing it and have to work harder to accomplish it.
Here now to tell more about Barbara Jordan and to offer up an observation on Texas politics is State Senator Rodney Ellis.
For an African-American woman to have the gall to run for the state senate in the early 60s and really have only a slim chance of winning took some real courage on her part. And then once she won, had become such a trailblazer, not only to be the first African-American woman, but one of the first women, period, to serve in the Texas Senate. They didn't even have a restroom on the second floor for women senators. Had to add one for her. But for her to come into that atmosphere and figure out how to survive, and not only survive, but how to prevail and stand out among her peers and pass meaningful legislation. I think she ought to be remembered as someone who saw a challenge, stood up to it, did well, knowing that not only did she have to do well for herself, but also serve as a role model for women, for other African Americans, for Hispanics, for people who had to break glass ceilings behind her.
In your opinion, is Texas politics a contact sport?
Very much a contact sport. I'd say out of the 50 states, probably Texas and Louisiana are more rough and tumble, and sort of similar in that regard. If you decide to put your name on the ballot in Texas, you need to be prepared for a free-for-all. I mean, we tend not to take it personal when it's over with. It's not a game for the faint. If you can't stand to get cut up and do a little cutting up, you probably ought to run for office in some other state.
Another trailblazer is former Texas Supreme Court Justice Raul Gonzalez, the first Hispanic to be appointed and later the first to be elected to statewide office in Texas.
There was a lot of speculation that an Hispanic could not win a statewide race, but the people of Texas responded extremely well and gave me the honor not only of being the first Hispanic to sit on the Texas Supreme Court, but the first Hispanic to be elected statewide. This is such a marvelous place. We have some of the giants in the legal profession that are interned here. People like Chief Justice Calvert, a person who was destitute growing up. His parents did not have any money, and he ended up in the Corsicana home, an orphanage. But what a blessing to live in this country and in Texas that allows people that have come from that background, like Justice Calvert, in an orphanage, gets educated, graduates, becomes a lawyer, Speaker of the House, and ultimately Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court.
While born in Virginia, Stephen F. Austin is known as the father of Texas. Although he died in 1836, his remains were moved to this prominent location in 1910.
No stranger in politics in Texas and beyond, the late George Christian shared stories of legendary Texans he had worked with.
Piece of Texas history, a very important piece, has been for many years. I was born in Austin, raised here, and since my great-grandparents were buried here in the 1920s, I obviously was quite familiar with it and visited out here over time. And then, of course, my father was buried here in 1941. So it has meant a lot to me personally, and I was quite pleased, really, when the State Cemetery Committee was created after the big renovation, and that Governor Bullock asked Governor Bush to appoint me to the Cemetery Committee, which I accepted. And I think Lieutenant Governor Bullock wanted me on the cemetery board so I would look after his gravesite.
You referred to the Johnson, Texas farm team. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Governor Connally was so close to President Johnson that President Johnson frequently looked to Governor Connally for recruits for his White House staff after he became president. And he recruited several people from Connally's staff to go to Washington, which might have depleted Connally, but that didn't bother Johnson.
The inscription on a photo in your office of Bob Bullock reads, "To George, my mentor." What can you tell me about that friendship and that mentoring relationship?
Bullock and I had a sometimes stormy relationship over the years. Sometimes we were on the same side and sometimes we weren't. When he ran for lieutenant governor, I decided in my own mind that he was the best man for the job, and I helped him. And we became a good bit closer late in his life, and I've treasured that friendship very much.
His reference to you as a mentor is interesting in that the president, George W. Bush, has oftentimes referred to Bob Bullock as his mentor. As the former press secretary of a Democratic president, do you find this bipartisan mentoring to be ironic, or is that par for the course in Texas politics?
I don't believe the average Texan really buys into excessive partisanship. We're pretty independent people, and whether you belong to one political party or another seems to get smudged when you're dealing with important matters for the state.
A legend in college sports, former University of Texas football coach Darrell Royal shared his thoughts on both politics and sports.
In your opinion, is sports ever political?
Let me answer your question pretty short. If a guy is head coach at the University of Texas and he's not interested in politics and doesn't know what's going on, he's a fool. I always said that I'd never be a teacher and I'd never be a politician. And I look back on my career and I was both. I was teaching a subject, I taught it year after year, and I was a politician. Not running for office, never intended, never even thought about it. But being aware of what's going on and who yanks the chains in Texas, the head football coach at the University of Texas needs to know that. Governor John Connally was a big Longhorn, and I remember he called me from Parkland Hospital when we were playing at Texas A&M. The Aggies and the Longhorns were in a football game, and it was just after the assassination. He was in the hospital, and he called me at the locker room from the hospital. And I said, "Oh, Governor, do you felt like watching the game?" He said, "Well, they didn't let me watch all of it. They let me watch parts of it." But he said, "I'm just calling you to congratulate you."
Former Texas State Comptroller John Sharp, who served in that office immediately after the late Bob Bullock, told of how he got his start in politics.
It's probably Manuela Gutierrez's fault. I remember she stood up in the 7th grade and someone decided we should have a class president at Plasto Elementary School, and Manuela nominated me, and I won that.
Was Bob Bullock a tough act to follow in your previous role as Texas State Comptroller?
Oh, you bet. I mean, I would, every night I would try to figure out how do you follow this guy, and told him when he was still alive that a lot of the success that we had with performance reviews, or whether it was in inventing the Tomorrow Fund or the Lone Star card and all those kind of things that we did, I always gave Bullock credit for it, because to follow the example that he set in moving that agency from really primitive times to the modern times was a tough act to follow, and we tried to do that every day.
Once the mayor of Austin, former Texas State Comptroller Carol Keaton Strayhorn talked about her earlier experience in politics and the influence of her parents.
When I was first elected mayor, it was touted I was the youngest woman mayor of a major city. Well, this last time I ran as one tough grandma, so you know a few decades have gone on in between. My dad, for 25 years, was dean of the law school at the University of Texas. He said it's when he grew up in Red River County picking cotton that he decided he was going to have a sit-down job the rest of his life. And I always say my dad taught the law, my mom was the law. I can remember my dad saying, "Carol, if you don't have somebody mad at you, you probably haven't done anything." So it's okay to have somebody mad at you if you're speaking up in those causes of human well-being and human decency.
Although he authored other books, Fred Gibson is probably best known for his work, Old Yeller.
The Texas State Cemetery is also the resting place for some of our state's biggest legends in law enforcement. Retired United States Marshal and former Texas Ranger Captain Jack Dean about some of those he had known. Stephen F. Austin's connection with the Texas Rangers.
Well, basically, Stephen F. Austin was the reason for the Rangers. In 1823, they were having so many Indian depredations in his settlements that he got a gentleman named Tumlinson to form a company of men to range out and protect the settlements, and that's basically where the Rangers evolved from. There's a gentleman that's here at the cemetery named Bill Wilson that was
a great role model for me. Bill was a senior ranger captain for a long time, well, when I was captain. And there's another gentleman that's a retired captain named Bob Mitchell up at Waco. I was a young highway patrolman over in East Texas, and Bob was a new ranger that showed up. Little short story, I ended up being his sergeant as a ranger when he made captain. So we've been close for years, but those two are probably the two that really stood out in modern times.
First day you ever met John B. Conley?
You really want to know?
Yes, I do.
Okay, we're at the University of Texas campus in front of the Union Building. I'm walking down one side of that esplanade, and he's coming up the other side. And I saw that good-looking, handsome guy, and I thought, wonder what I can do to attract him. And finally we were right opposite one another, and we just looked at each other. And then I went my way, and he went his way. But I thought, as I went my way, poor guy, he doesn't know his bachelor days are over. That's when we first met.
You once told me that of all the jobs your husband had, the one that you liked the best was when he was governor of Texas, because you got to see him at lunch on a regular basis.
He'd come home to lunch, and he would bring interesting people home for lunch. And I also liked when he had men over and they were discussing all sorts of important things. I could sit at the top of the stairs and hear everything they said down there. I like that.
November 22nd, 1963, a date that you've no doubt been asked to recall and recount on numerous occasions. At the first mention of that date, what memories come to mind?
When we got to the hospital, the Secret Service was running around, they were crying, they were running around the car, and they were trying to get Miss Kennedy out of the car, and she would not get out of the car. John is in my lap, and all of a sudden, he just heaves himself up and then just fell over toward the door. And I asked him later, I said, what were you doing? Why? He said, I knew that the door was right by me on the right, and that they couldn't get the president out the door unless I got out of the way. Well, of course, they didn't move John, and what they finally ended up doing, they told me, was they lifted the president out over the back and took him in. And then somebody came and picked up John and put him on a stretcher, and the two stretchers went off down the hall. And I just went running behind the stretcher. What I was running from and what I was running to, I didn't know, but run I must, that much I knew. After I brought John back from Parkland Hospital, in 2 or 3 days, after I had him good settled in, I got some yellow pads and papers and pens, and I went off in a quiet place in the mansion, and I wrote what happened in that car. I didn't write that for history or for the world. I wrote it for little Conleys that were going to come along in case someday in history class they read about the Kennedy assassination. They might have thought, I wonder how my great-great-great-grandmother felt that day.
Prior to a major renovation, which was completed in 1997, the Texas State Cemetery was very different from the way it looks today. The late Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock was a leading force in that renovation.
I've heard the story often of how Bob Bullock used to come here oftentimes at night and crawl over the fence and walk the grounds of the cemetery, and he was later given a key. What did coming here do for him?
Well, first of all, he didn't need a lot of sleep, let me put it that way. So it probably was during the hours when he couldn't sleep, and he loved to be up close to historical monuments, especially the Texas State Cemetery, because there were so many people that contributed to a part in our government, and so he loved coming out here. It was a very sacred ground for him. When I first met him, we would drive to South Texas, and he would stop along the road, and we'd drive in these cemeteries, and I thought, what a strange person this is. But then I soon had a love of Texas history as well.
It's a well-known fact that he could be very tough, but tell me about the Bob Bullock that you knew.
Well, he didn't take himself seriously at all. Anyone that knows him and followed Texas politics knew that he was always telling stories on himself. He was always laughing about his foibles, and of course he had many flaws and many warts, and he was always sharing them with the public. And I think that the public liked that, and they, as he used to say, he thought the public might think, well, there's a little bit of Bullock in all of us.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope that you've enjoyed this insightful look into this great Texas treasure and the lives represented here. I encourage you to visit the Texas State Cemetery and visit its website. Until next time, I'm Glenn Bass.
It's a part of Texas, and everybody should know about this cemetery. They should come out and look at it. It's beautiful.